It was a hot summer day in Verona, Mississippi, and I was sitting at my desk, sipping on a cold drink when the phone rang. I picked it up, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. But what I heard next would change everything I thought I knew about Elvis Presley. "Mr. Lindberg, this is Julian Riley. I just read your book, Letters from Elvis." My heart skipped a beat. Julian Riley. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I leaned forward, suddenly alert. "Mr. Riley, it's an honor. I didn't expect to hear from you. What did you think of the book?" There was a pause, and then he said, "I believe everything in it, especially the part about Vernon not being Elvis's father." My mouth went dry. I had written that part based on a letter Elvis had written to his confidante, Carmen Montes. It was a bold claim, one that had sparked a lot of controversy. But hearing it confirmed by someone from Tupelo, the very place where Elvis was born, was shocking. "You sound pretty confident about this," I managed to say, trying to keep my voice steady. "I am. I've been researching Elvis's family for over a decade, built an online family tree with more than 38,000 names, and I've been collecting DNA samples from all the branches of the family tree. No one has ever done this for Elvis. It's amazing what you can learn when you do something like that." I was speechless. 38,000 names, DNA samples. This was more than I could have ever imagined. "I've lived in Tupelo all my life," Julian continued. "I think we should work together. I can help you get to the bottom of this." I couldn't believe my luck. Here was a local expert who had the same intense interest in Elvis as I did. We were on the same page, and we had the potential to uncover the true story of Elvis's origin. "Sure, send me your book," I said, still trying to process everything. A few days later, Julian's book arrived. It was titled The Roots of Elvis, A Genealogical Journey. As I flipped through the pages, I realized that this was no ordinary book. It was a treasure trove of information, filled with detailed family trees, historical documents, and personal stories that I had never heard before. I spent the next few weeks poring over Julian's book, calling him almost daily to discuss new leads and theories. We started to piece together a narrative that was far more complex and fascinating than anything I had read in any conventional biography. Elvis's family history was a tangled web of secrets, scandals, and unexpected connections. It was a story that had been hidden for decades, buried under layers of myth and misinformation. But with Julian's help, I was determined to bring it to light. We began by tracing Elvis's roots back to Itawamba County, Mississippi, where his great-grandparents lived. We visited old family homes, talked to distant relatives, and dug through dusty archives. Each piece of the puzzle we found only deepened the mystery. One of the first things we discovered was the story of Effie and Mary Jane, two of Elvis's great-grandmothers. They were sisters who had grown up on the Hussey farm, a place that played a crucial role in the Presley family's history. Effie and Mary Jane's lives were marked by tragedy and hardship, but they also had a significant impact on the man Elvis would become. We also uncovered the story of John Wallace, a distant relative who had a complicated relationship with the Presley family. John Wallace had moved to Texas, where he had a series of affairs and children out of wedlock. His connections to the Presley family were murky, but they were undeniably important. As we delved deeper, we found more and more evidence that suggested Vernon Presley might not have been Elvis's biological father. The DNA samples Julian had collected were starting to paint a different picture of Elvis's parentage. We were on the verge of uncovering a truth that would shock the world, but the journey was just beginning. There were more secrets to uncover, more stories to tell, and I was determined to find out the truth, no matter where it led. The phone call from Julian Riley was the start of an incredible adventure. It was the beginning of a journey that would take us through the thorny briar patch of Elvis Presley's family history, a journey that would reveal the true origins of one of the most famous men in the world. I met Julian Riley, my guide into the world of Elvis Presley, on a warm afternoon in Mississippi. He was a well of information, a man rooted deeply in Tupelo, just like Elvis. Julian had a knack for connecting dots that no one else could see, and he was as passionate about uncovering the truth as I was. One day, Julian and I were wandering through Priceville Memorial Gardens, a cemetery in Tupelo where many of Elvis's relatives are buried. Julian pointed out a couple of spots where fans believed Elvis's stillborn twin, Jesse, might be buried. As we stood there, Julian suddenly stopped and said, "Will you look at that?" An enormous angel statue, over 4 feet tall, had appeared in the family plot next to Sales Presley and his wife. Julian was certain it hadn't been there a few weeks ago. He thought maybe a fan had placed it there as a tribute to little Jessie. The angel's face looked strikingly like a young Elvis, which only added to the mystery. It was a moment that solidified my belief that Julian was the right person to help me unravel the mysteries of Elvis's past. Julian's family history was intertwined with Elvis's in ways that were both surprising and fascinating. Julian was born in 1942 and grew up in South Tupelo, the same neighborhood where Elvis and his parents, Gladys and Vernon, lived in the late 1930s. After Vernon was sent to Parchman Prison for forging a check, the Presleys moved in with Gladys's second cousin, Frank Richards, on Maple Street. Julian's father, Wade Riley, worked for the local newspaper, and his grandfather, Noon Riley, owned a mule barn and one of the first used car lots in Tupelo. Julian's uncle, Lawrence Riley, worked at the car lot, and it's possible that he and Gladys Presley struck up a friendship as she passed by on her way to work at the garment factory. Julian's uncle, Leon, worked at Tupelo Hardware, the store where Gladys bought Elvis his first guitar for his 11th birthday. The clerk who sold the guitar, Forrest Bobo, was related to Vernon Presley's cousin, Dusky Presley. Small-town connections like these were common in Tupelo, and they added layers to the story of Elvis's early life. In the summer of 1948, Julian's family moved to Verona, a small town where Elvis's parents, Gladys and Vernon, had also lived for a short time. Julian's aunt, Evie Hodges, owned a grocery store in Verona, and Julian spent many afternoons there with his cousins and friends. One of these friends, Jimmy Williams, had a great-grandfather who was the Justice of the Peace who married Vernon and Gladys in Verona. Julian eventually bought the Verona Town Hall, where that marriage took place, adding another layer to the connection between his family and Elvis's. Julian's grandfather, Noon Riley, owned a livestock barn in a part of Tupelo called Shake Rag, a poor area known for its dirt roads and shacks without indoor plumbing. Some historians claim Elvis developed his love for black music in Shake Rag, but Julian pointed out that this was unlikely. Shake Rag was a place of poverty and crime, not a hub of music. Elvis's family lived on the edge of Shake Rag, but not in it, and Gladys would never have let Elvis roam there at night. Julian's aunt, Zora Mears, was a close friend of Elvis's mother, Gladys. They had grown up near each other and attended the same school. Zora married Julian's uncle, Lawrence Riley, and the two families remained close. Zora often accompanied Gladys and Elvis on bus rides to visit Vernon in Parchman Prison. She remembered Elvis as a lively child who loved to sing and perform. After the Presleys moved to Memphis, they would return to East Tupelo to visit, and Elvis would spend time with Julian's cousins, hunting rabbits and sharing meals. Julian's interest in history began when he was a young boy, finding an Indian arrowhead on his grandfather's farm. This sparked a lifelong passion, and he accumulated one of the largest collections of Indian artifacts in Mississippi. His knowledge of the area's history and his connections to Elvis's family made him an invaluable guide as I delved deeper into the story of Elvis's roots. Together, we were ready to uncover the truths that had been hidden for so long. Julian and I spent a lot of time digging through old records and stories about Elvis's family. One of the best memories Julian had was going to Andrew's Chapel, a small church near the Westmoreland farm. His mom, Jewel, would bring peanut butter sandwiches and water for the kids to munch on during the long services. There were all-day singings and big potluck dinners where everyone brought food to share. We'd also walk through the old cemetery, but to us, it was just a place with lots of gravestones of people we didn't know. When Julian went to Mississippi State University, he wrote a paper about Richmond, the town near the Westmoreland farm. He found out that Richmond was one of the oldest towns in Lee County, founded in 1840. Many families from Richmond also settled in Verona and Tupelo. Julian didn't realize how much these places were connected to Elvis's story until later. In 1991, Julian's love for history led him to buy two of the oldest buildings in Verona. One was the old post office, and the other was the first bank in Lee County. In 2004, he bought a third building that used to be the Verona Town Hall. It had been a church and a Masonic lodge. Julian started a big project to fix up these buildings, In 1983, Julian got into politics. He had a tough time winning his first election, but he tried again and became the Chancery Clerk and Registrar of Lee County. As the Chancery Clerk, his job was to keep all the public records. This meant he knew a lot about the people and history of the county. One of the things Julian discovered was the true story of how Elvis's parents, Vernon and Gladys, got married. They ran away to Verona on June 17, 1933, to get married. Vernon's dad didn't like him much and wouldn't give permission for the wedding. So Vernon, who was only 17, and Gladys went to Pontotoc County to get a marriage license. They lied about their ages and got the license. Then a cousin named Marshall Spencer Brown and his wife, Vona Mee Presley Brown, drove them back to Verona. A justice of the peace named Robert Emmett Kelly married them in the Verona town hall. Julian was upset when he found out that some people had written wrong information about this. In a book called Gladys and Elvis by Elaine Dundee, it said they got married in Pontotoc. Julian had a letter that proved they were married in Verona. He didn't understand why people didn't check their facts before writing books. Julian and I met a local resident named Rachel Ann Harden, who knew a lot about Elvis. She and Julian started working together to gather more historical information. They held meetings where people could share their stories. This led to the publication of a book called The Roots of Elvis Presley in 2010. Later, Julian started a big project to collect DNA samples from Elvis's family. He wanted to figure out who was related to whom and how. Nearly 100 people have given DNA samples, and the results have been amazing. The family tree is being updated, and new family members are being found. To understand how DNA works, you need to know that it's like a code that tells your body how to grow and function. Every person's DNA is different, which is why we can compare DNA samples to see if people are related. DNA is found in almost every cell in your body, and it's arranged in a spiral shape called a double helix. When two DNA samples match, it means the people are related. Julian uses DNA to help build a more accurate family tree of Elvis. He works with popular DNA services like Ancestry, Com and 23andMe to find matches. He also uses an online service called GD Match, which lets people upload their DNA results from different companies to find more matches. One of the biggest challenges is that Elvis's DNA isn't available for comparison. But Julian has so much DNA from Elvis's family that he can use a process called DNA triangulation to figure out how someone is related to Elvis. This has helped solve a lot of family puzzles, and even helped an adopted person find their biological father. One interesting story Julian found was about Elvis's great-uncle, Noah Presley. In 1918, Noah bought a farm near Tremont for $600. But a year later, he sold it for $500, losing $100. Then he packed up his whole family and moved to East Tupelo. It was like a modern-day version of Noah's Ark. Julian found this out by looking at old records, and it's just one of the many fascinating stories he's uncovered about Elvis's family. Julian and I were driving to a small cemetery near Richmond. He had a story to tell, one that tied his own family to Elvis Presley's in a surprising way. Back in 2000, Julian was working on his family tree. He decided to visit Andrews Chapel Cemetery, a place he knew well from his childhood. As a kid, he had played among the headstones and joined in the Sunday singings. But he had never really thought about the people buried there, beyond his own relatives. On that day, as he walked among the graves, something caught his eye. He stopped in front of a weathered concrete tombstone. The inscription read, Effie, daughter of R. L. and Doll Smith, born July 21, 1904, died Sept. 17, 1905, gone but not forgotten. The names are L. and Doll Smith. Rang a bell. Julian's mind raced. Robert Lee and Doll Smith were Gladys Love Presley's parents. He realized they were Elvis's maternal grandparents. The Effie buried here must have been Gladys's sister. Julian was excited. This small tombstone was a link between his family and Elvis's. Effie had been just a year old when she died, and her short life had been a mystery to most people. But now Julian had uncovered a piece of Elvis's family history. We stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The cemetery was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. Julian pointed out other graves of his relatives, but his focus kept returning to Effie's. He explained that Effie's death must have been a devastating blow to the Smith family. Gladys, who was about 4 years older than Effie, would have been old enough to understand the loss. It was a tragedy that stayed with the family, even though Effie's life was so short. Julian's discovery had sparked a deeper interest in the connection between his family and Elvis's. He started digging into more records, talking to older relatives, and piecing together the story of how these families intertwined. As we left the cemetery, Julian was already thinking about the next clue he might uncover. The simple tombstone of Effie Smith had opened a door to a rich and complex family history, one that would lead to more surprises and connections. For Julian, this was just the beginning of a journey that would bring him closer to understanding the roots of one of the most famous families in American history. Back in 2006, after I bought the old Verona Town Hall building where Elvis's parents, Vernon and Gladys, got married, I started digging deeper into Elvis's local roots. One day, I took a friend to the Andrews Chapel Cemetery to show him the crumbling tombstone of Effie Smith, a relative of mine. As we walked through the rows of old stones, my friend suddenly pointed to a grave that said Mary Jane Presley. "Hey, there's a Presley buried right here," he said. "Don't know who that one is," I replied. "There are some others around the cemetery too. Wish they could talk to us." "Only way is through their headstones, I guess, if somebody would listen," he joked. "Well, there'll be wait. In a long time, not many visitors come here anymore." I had seen Mary Jane Presley's headstone countless times growing up, but this time it made me curious. I wanted to know who this mysterious woman was. Back home, I dove back into my research, trying to find out more about Rosalinda Presley, Elvis's paternal great-great-aunt. There was very little information about her, and it was frustrating. I knew that the story of Elvis Presley actually began with two sisters in Itawamba County, Rosalinda and Rosella Presley. Rosella was generally considered Elvis's paternal great-great-grandmother, but there was a lot of mystery surrounding both of them. I spent hours in the library, going through cemetery books and census records, looking for any mention of Rosalinda, Rosa, or even Rosella. One day, I found a name that caught my attention, Rosie Presley, listed as buried at Ridge Cemetery in northeastern Itawamba County. I thought this might be Rosella, so I drove out to Ridge Cemetery to check it out. The headstone had the wrong first name and a misspelled middle name, but it was definitely Rosella. I found out that the original marker had just said, "Our Mother," and was later replaced with the granite marker that had incorrect information. I also learned from family members that an unmarked grave near Rosella's was the resting place of a grandchild, a close cousin of Elvis, who died before being named. It was a small, sad detail, but it added to the story. The next mystery was Mary Jane Presley. I had a grave site, but no information about the person in it. I went back to the library and started going through county census records, looking for Rosalinda, Rosa, or Presley. I found a man named John a Presley in Monroe County, known as Big John because of his height. One of the few things known about Rosalinda was that she had a son named John a Presley, so I looked closer at the census record for his household. Most of the names were John's siblings, but one woman was much older. She must have been John's mother, but her name wasn't Rosalinda, it was Mary Jane. Suddenly, it clicked. Rosalinda's given name was actually Mary Jane. Rosalinda was probably just a nickname. I had found Rosalinda Presley's grave, marked with her real name Mary Jane Presley. I went to the Wee Peg's funeral home in Tupelo, and the ladies there helped me find more information. They showed me the cemetery book, and there was her name Mary Jane Presley. I found out she died on November 16, 1932. Less than 2 years before Elvis was born. She was 68 years, 3 months, and 4 days old when she passed away. Backtracking from her date of death, I calculated that she was probably born on Christmas Day, December 25, 1863. Rosalinda hadn't disappeared from the records, she had just been misidentified. Now that I knew her real name, I could uncover more of her story and how she contributed to the roots of Elvis Presley. The cemetery and chapel were on land next to the Hussey farm, owned by Tom and Charles Hussey. The workers on the farm, many of whom were sharecroppers, were buried in Andrews Chapel Cemetery. The cemetery was a roll call of all the families who had lived and worked together, married into each other's families, and died poor. They had moved there to work the Hussey farm, even though living conditions were harsh. When I visited the cemetery in 2020, I felt like I was seeing it for the first time. The tombstones looked like little houses, lined up in neighborhoods. Westmoreland's over there, Presley's here, some Mansells to the left, Tackett's and Smith's, I said, pointing to the different sections. This is not just the story of the Presleys, I continued. It's the story of how all these families loved each other, had kids together, and buried each other. My family story is interwoven with all these others, and this graveyard is where these folks all came together one last time. The real story of Elvis Presley starts with the two Presley sisters, Rosella and Mary Jane, who people often called Rosalinda. But there would be no story without a man named John Wallace. He was a colorful and mysterious figure who fathered Elvis's grandfather, Jesse D. I started searching for John Wallace in 2006 because of clues suggesting he might have been Jesse D's father. In 2006, the only person who had seriously researched Elvis's family was Roy Turner, a Tupelo resident. Most of his attention had been on Gladys's side of the family, the Smiths and Mansells. His research had been used in Elaine Dundee's book, Elvis and Gladys. After speaking about my research at an Itawamba Historical Society meeting, a woman gave me the name and phone number of a man she said was related to Elvis's great-grandfather. It took a while, but I finally contacted Mackie Hargett, who claimed to be an unknown relative of Elvis. Mackie told me an astonishing story. His grandmother, Elnora Wallace Yarber, had told the family that she had a half-brother named Jesse D. McDowell Presley, who was Elvis's grandpa. Mackie's grandmother was the oldest daughter of John Wallace and his wife, Almira. I became convinced that Mackie was telling the truth, and that John Wallace was a real person. With a name and more information, I discovered that John Wallace was born on August 1, 1853, in Itawamba County, to parents Hugh and Lydia. He had two sisters, Molly and Melinda, and a brother, Willis. His mother, Lydia, died shortly after Willis was born. John's father remarried a few years later. John couldn't read or write, and he made an X for his signature on documents. After the Civil War, many young men left Mississippi and moved to Texas. In 1877, John married Rachel Barlow in Collin County, Texas. They had a son, George Hugh Wallace, in 1878, but by the 1880 census, John was listed as a widower. Rachel might have died from childbirth complications, which was common back then. Their son, George, might have died young too. John's brother, Willis, was also interested in a woman named Rosella Presley. The Presley sisters, Rosella and Mary Jane, lived just a few houses away from the Wallaces on White Springs Road. Sometime after the 1880 census, John moved back to Tilden, Mississippi, probably encouraged by his relatives. If he hadn't moved back, there would be no Elvis Presley. Back in Tilden, John was a young man without a wife and needed help with his child. He married Almira Jane McFadden on December 23, 1880. Almira's father had been killed during the war, and she needed a husband to help manage the farm. They were a good match. John was a talented fiddle player and played at barn dances, church socials, and local parties. He also played at the White Springs Resort, where he might have met and spent time with Rosella Presley. The girls in Tilden probably liked handsome, talented John Wallace, just as girls today like musicians. This is how the roots of Elvis Presley began, with the Presley sisters and a young man named John Wallace. I was digging through the history of John Wallace, and it's a wild story. John had a bunch of kids with his wife Almira, but he also had a thing for this woman named Rosella Presley. If not for John and Rosella's affair, Elvis Presley might not have even been born. This affair caused a big rift between John and his brother, and they never really made up. John and Almira had 9 kids over 23 years. They had a pretty big family, and their kids were all named Wallace. There was Elnora, Betty Lovey, Robbie C., Ossie Howard, John Kirby, Selma Ann, Jesse Pearl, Willie Mee, and Archie Homer. It's a lot of names to keep track of, but they were all part of this big family. Not far from where John lived, there was this fancy resort called White Springs. It was a place where rich people would go to have fun and relax. They had dances, and people would stay for weeks at a time. John was a good musician, and I think he probably played at the resort a lot. That's where he likely met Rosella Presley. Rosella and her sister, Mary Jane, lived nearby. They weren't as poor as people thought. They actually lived in a cabin provided by a man named William Marion Steele, who was like a stepfather to them. They went to dances and parties at the resort, and probably worked there too. It was a good way to make some extra money. Rosella and Mary Jane were known for having affairs with wealthy men. They had a lot of kids with different daddies. Rosella had 9 kids, and Mary Jane had 6. It was a different time, and people didn't have a lot of options for making money. So they did what they had to do to survive. Rosella's dad, Vernon Presley, was a bit of a wanderer. He was married a few times and had kids with different women. He fought in the Civil War and was part of General Nathan Bedford Forrest's army. After the war, he left his second wife, Martha Jane Wesson, and his 2 daughters, Rosella and Mary Jane, in Mississippi. They were only 5 when their mom died, and they ended up living with William Steele and his new wife, Sarah. As the girls grew older, things got a bit complicated. Sarah probably didn't like having these pretty teenagers around the house, so they ended up moving in with their grandma, Millie Bowen Wesson. They helped her with farming and probably worked at the resort to make money. Rosella never married, and people have wondered why. A lot of young men had died in the war, so there weren't many options. Plus, life was tough, and women had to do what they could to survive. Having children with wealthy men probably helped them get some support, even if the men couldn't publicly admit it. One of Rosella's daughters, Dashi, said they never talked about who their dad was, but I think they knew. It's hard to keep secrets in a small house in a small town. The kids probably knew who their dad was, but they didn't want to talk about it because it was a sensitive topic. John Wallace and Rosella Presley's story is a bit messy, but it's a big part of Elvis's family history. It shows how complicated life can be, and how sometimes the most unexpected things can lead to something amazing, like the birth of a music legend. I found out that Robbie Presley, born in 1903, was another one of Rosella's kids. Just like Calhoun and Mac, Robbie's dad was Robert A. Bud Steele. Bud was Rosella's stepfather's brother, which makes things pretty complicated. Bud was a few years older than Rosella, and they lived in the same area. After Calhoun was born in 1899, Bud moved away to Corinth, which is about 70 miles from where they were living, but he didn't stay away for long. In 1902, he came back, and that's when Mac was born. Then a year later, in 1903, Robbie was born. I think Bud kept coming back to see Rosella, even though it was risky. Maybe he felt something for her, or maybe he just couldn't stay away. Whatever the reason, it's clear that Bud and Rosella had a relationship that lasted for a while. Robbie, like his brothers, didn't have an easy life. He was born into a world where family secrets were kept hidden, and the people around him probably didn't know the full story. But Robbie grew up and had a life of his own. He worked hard and did the best he could, just like his mom. It's hard to imagine what it must have been like for Rosella, raising all these kids with different fathers. She must have been really strong to keep going, even when things got tough. And it's clear that she had a lot of love for her kids, no matter who their dads were. Even though the details of their lives are often hidden, the story of Rosella and her kids shows how complicated family can be. But it also shows how much love and strength can come from the most unexpected places. As I look back on the lives of Jessie D and Minnie Mae, I can see how their story fits into the larger tapestry of the Presley family. Jessie D, my great-grandfather, was a complicated man. Born to Rosella Presley and John Wallace, he was one of many children in a family where the fathers were often not around. Jessie was born on a farm owned by Joshua Steele, and his name was recorded as Jessie D. McLowell Presley, a mistake that caused confusion for years. Despite not knowing how to read or write, Rosella must have trusted the person who wrote down Jessie's name, but a small error led to a name that didn't exist. Jessie grew up working hard to support his family, who never owned a home and relied on help from friends and the fathers of Rosella's children. When he was 15, he started a family with Minnie Mae Hood, who was about 7 years older than him. They had 5 children together, including Vernon, who would later become the father of Elvis Presley. Jesse was tall and slender, with blue eyes and black hair. He registered for the World War I draft and may have served in the military. After the war, he moved his family to East Tupelo, where he worked as a farmer and carpenter. Jesse was demanding and vain, often flaunting his fine clothes and keeping his whiskey locked up. He was hard on his children, especially Vernon, whom he kicked out of the house at 16. Their relationship remained bitter for the rest of their lives. Minnie Mae, my great-grandmother, came from a family that had been in Itawamba County since the 1830s. Her grandfather, Joshua Hood, built a cabin when they first arrived, and it's likely that Minnie was born there in 1890. Her family had deep roots in the area, and many of her relatives still live nearby. Minnie was strong and resilient, raising her children with little help from Jesse. In 1927, Jesse bought property on Old Saltillo Road in East Tupelo, where he worked hard to provide for his family. He paid off the loan in 1934 and owned the property until Elvis bought him a house in Kentucky years later. Despite his efforts, Jesse's relationship with his family was strained. He was often absent, working in different places, and even moved to the Mississippi Gulf Coast to work in shipyards. Eventually, he settled in Louisville, Kentucky, where he worked as a night watchman at a Pepsi Cola plant. In 1948, when Elvis was almost 14, Jesse married Vera Kinnaird, a woman he met at the Pepsi Cola plant. They had no children together, and Jesse lied about his family on the marriage license, hoping to hide his complicated past. When he died in 1973, his wife repeated the lies on his death certificate, perpetuating the confusion about his family history. Minnie Mae, on the other hand, stayed in Tupelo and raised her children with the help of the community. She was a strong and loving mother, and her legacy lives on in the many family gatherings and the deep connections we have with our relatives in Itawamba County. Despite the challenges they faced, Jesse and Minnie Mae's story is a part of our family history. Their lives, filled with hardship and resilience, shaped the person Elvis Presley would become. Their legacy is one of survival and the enduring bonds of family, even in the face of adversity.